Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Bears of Fly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Telegram, Locals, and Facebook. And supporting me on the appropriate places as well, including buying me a coffee. So this is the last full week of content I have this year. I'm going to be taking the last 2 weeks of December off. And last December, I had a year in review video, which I thought would be pretty good to open up the final week that I'm doing content here. And what's interesting is in how things don't quite turn out the way you would have expected. So what I hoped to do last year was to do some more stuff on a religion and some more stuff on history. That didn't quite pan out the way I expected. It ended up happening was a big turn took place with my sort of refining of the anti-technology perspective, which was being formulated in 2022 with some of my casual stream episodes, but really started to get honed in and focused on for this year. And which is what's really nice about that, as well as that my appearance on Millennial this Thursday will be about just that, about the sort of like where I've gotten to this point about collapse and technology and everything like that. So that's going to be pretty cool. This is also going to be a sort of like AMA, so if anybody wants to ask any questions, they can go ahead and do that in the chat. If you're super chatted, I'll make sure to get to that first. And one thing also is that if we look at how we've gone, I started Sutton shortly after with his Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, his a brief summary of Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution and some of its findings. That then became a sort of book reading series where I would read through his Wall Street series. And now tomorrow I'll finish Sutton's work on The Best Money Enemy Can Buy. And the sort of inspiration for all this was Minoan, who said in I forget which video that, I'm not going to read the books you recommend, but I'll watch you read them. So I thought, okay, well, let's go ahead and do that. So that's been pretty good. If people want me to keep doing that, there's other books or other concepts or ideas, such as The Historical Blackout with Harry Elmer Barnes, which is extremely important, that needs to get out there. I could read through that if people would still want me to do that. Also, I could read through Confessions of Monopolists by Frederick C. Howe, one of the books that influences the framework and thinking of Anthony Sutton. So those are all useful adjacent things. I also did that series on The Machine Stops, where I read The Machine Stops, and then I gave commentary on each chapter, big ideas on each chapter. And that seemed to be quite popular as well. And that's sort of, I think, what got lots of people tuning in to my anti-technology critique. And The Machine Stops is a great little slim book. I think probably people were reading along with me at the time, that sort of exposes all this, which was great. Now, we've seen also a lot of changes this year as well. So Logos and I were pretty regularly doing the Church Fathers series, as well as the Escaping the Moldbug Matrix series. But as with Terminal Philosophy last year in our History of Warfare series, IRL considerations got in the way. And I wouldn't say they're ended in the sense that I wouldn't consider resuming them if life situations change, but currently right now Logos isn't really available. But I think these were great series, and again, if the only thing I'd want to add more with Moldbug, because it is true that Logos and I, after year one of UR and getting into year two, the only thing really left to consider, because Moldbug hasn't changed at all in the 16 years since he did that in 2007, all the stuff he said on Orrin McIntyre this year was stuff that he had said 16 years ago. It didn't even change. Would be his open letter to an open-minded progressive. If we go back to Moldbug, that's all we're going to do, and then we're going to consider it done. But right now, time constraints prevent that from happening. The other thing was, again, the Church Fathers one. Also, that was in large part dropped because it just wasn't getting the viewership. And Logos was already sort of tapped out with the Moldbug Matrix. So, as time pressures get on, We also had another big replacement on the Lyceum Roundtable, right? So Terminal Philosophy was unable to make it due to life issues, just like with the History of Warfare series. And there were conflict scheduling issues with Swithin and anybody else that we might bring on. So Swithin had been around since the very, very beginning, along with Keith. So other than Keith and I, Swithin was the oldest hand we had on deck. But in order to make room for the two new people that Keith recommended, Alexei and Florian, both of whom have made excellent contributions so far, we've had a bit of a reshuffle for the Lyceum Roundtable. Hard to believe we're at episode 94. It's been almost 100 episodes of that. So a lot's happened then. The casual streams, which were started last year, have continued. They seem to be pretty popular. Of course, I had some pretty big guests like Charles Haywood on. Also, I haven't done a whole lot more. The Why I'm Not an X series. Those seem to be quite popular as well. If anybody has recommendations for that, I might even post something later on Twitter or the YouTube community post about, possible Why I'm Not X future episode choices. I have a few in my mind that I'm working on for next year, so we can see those as well. That's probably just another series all by itself. That we'll keep going, of course. And let's see. Oh, what else do we got that's changed this year? I think the main thing is that most of this channel now has become basically current events with the roundtable and sort of anti-technology perspective. For a while, Moldbug was a big part of it, but again, for reasons I've already stated, Moldbug is no longer as big a part of this channel. And I think pretty clearly there was the division. You either supported the Moldbug perspective or you didn't. But ultimately, I think Moldbug is sort of his own worst enemy. He's just, digging the hole deeper, so to speak, for himself. And of course, I already sensed at the time that his position was weakening. And that, I guess, to sort of give a summary also maybe a little bit of the DR on the last year, it's just kind of crazy. Like, I mean, the Shieldings event was great. I was there and I did a roundup on that this year. Oh yeah, of course. I met Michael Pohl, who's been a regular contributor to the show now, which is great. I'm glad we have Michael Pohl. And then the Doomsman. So yeah, IRL online crossover, right? You meet these people in real life and then they, contribute to your show online. And it's kind of one of those success stories that we want to see. And we'll have more of them in the future. I've already got some episodes planned with Michael Pohl and the Doomsman on Baudrillard and Lovecraft in the future. So stay tuned. January, February, you should see some of those episodes drop. So that'll be really good. You can expect to also see more of the technology stuff. I don't know what I predict will happen is after my appearance on Millennial, what's going to happen is that's going to become popular again. And there's going to be a lot of more new interest in the topic. And so that'll lead to more questions, that'll lead to hopefully more constructive engagement with viewers and other content creators, which could then lead to new concepts, which, I can't even imagine at the moment. But we'll see more of that. We'll see more of the roundtable. We need something special for episode 100. Or we're getting close. Sometime in March, we'll probably get to episode 100 of the roundtable, which, that's commitment. You got 100 episodes out there now. It's pretty good. And then, if I still do the book readings, I think we have plenty of books for those. I just wonder how popular they are, if there's any other preferred topic slot that we could put in there. That'll be an open question, I guess, too. And when you look at sort of, at least my perspective is, there's that statement that Twitter is like a 30-point IQ drop. And that's certainly the case. I mean, obviously at the Shieldings event, a lot of people that I met were very civil, very intelligent, very erudite. And it's like you interact with a lot of these same people on Twitter, and it's like totally different people. It's like they're the terminally online aspect of a lot of the DR is is challenging and frustrating because you know these people are better than this, right? You know from personal experience that they can do better than this, but there just really isn't this nice middle, right? Because we don't all live within walking distance of each other, so we can't go to the pub. Okay, I mean, I get that. But, Twitter is not also the best place either. I'm not really entirely at all. I'm not even sure where this Red Caesar thing is coming from, especially with regards to Musk. It's like there's literally nothing in the American context right now that I think of anything as like a Caesar moment. So if we look at say the three historical examples that people like to point to of a Caesar, Julius Caesar himself in the Republican crisis of the 1st century BC, or Oliver Cromwell in the parliamentary crisis of the 17th century, or Francisco Franco in the Spanish Civil War in the early 20th century. Okay, well, all three of those had a system in crisis like ours today, true. But in each of these cases, the military was powerful and independent from the central government in many regards, and was unified around a person. So Caesar himself built a patronage loyalty with the soldiers around an ideology, Puritanism with Oliver Cromwell, and a kind of Spanish nationalist reactionary thought with Franco. The military is an absolute mess today. It's in the United States. It's nothing like the militaries of Caesar, Cromwell, or Franco. There's no comparison at all between that. Now, then you might say, well, he could come from the tech sector, or the economy. But historically, any sort of equivalent would be merchant houses or something. Those are the people that lose to a Caesar, not where Caesar comes from. Now, I think a lot of this is part of a reading of Francis Park Yockey's Imperium, which is just bubbling up into a more popular statement. Now, I don't really know the theory behind Yockey and his idea of Caesar, but I just don't see this as an irrelevant at all analysis for our current political situation. I think our current political situation is really the military aspect. I don't see that as important. I mean, exactly how are they going to mobilize troops to occupy the country? They can't even get recruits for the army now. This is just how bad it is. And furthermore, in all of these situations, in Rome, in England, and in Spain, the population was growing. So you had a growing population to be funneled into the military to fight. Here we have a declining population. That doesn't mean there won't be wars. There's wars in Ukraine and Gaza right now, so that's still going to happen. But for a kind of revolutionary movement at home, even Lenin, right, in the Bolshevik Revolution, Russia's population was exploding at the time. And so you had this vast mass of manpower to tap into, to organize, to radicalize, which doesn't exist today at all. It just doesn't exist at all today. And so to me, it seems unlikely, and I'm still not entirely clear where this angle is coming from. That just seems to be one of the aspects of being terminally online, it would seem, for me on the dissident right. Maybe somebody in the chat has something to say about that. But other aspects over the year, this idea that, well, okay, we'll go back to Moldbug because this still ties into Moldbug. The idea that we're actually living under a democracy, and that this current democracy isn't working is just, and it just needs to die. We're obviously not living in a democracy. We're obviously living in an oligarchy. It's obviously an oligarchy, well, or a technocracy. At this point, it's hard to tell who has more power, the scientific elite or the financial elite. Because in many ways, the scientific elite are like the priests of the Middle Ages who tell you what to think, right? They create the entire framework for our thought. So in that regard, even merchants and princes have to, yield to the priests because the priests tell them what to think. Those are the most powerful people. And then I guess when it comes to wielding direct power, it would be commercial enterprises. I mean, most people, most of the time, don't have a whole lot of dealings with the government. They deal with financial powers and forces and institutions all of the time. And so this is clearly what's governing the country. This is clearly what's motivating all that's being done. And the dissident right just doesn't see this. It was just bizarre, right? It's bizarre because they used to. So 2011, turn the clock back 12 years. And then, that's when I got clued into this with the Andy Nowicki, Colin Liddell, Richard Spencer alt-right podcast. That course got started even earlier. I think the term was coined by Paul Gottfried in 2008 or 9. They understood this. And, there was a lot of third positionism. Now it's become like, libertarianism. And it's like, well, if we're just going to have more libertarianism, that's the problem already. Right? I refer back to about a month or two ago, the video I did with Michael Pohl about reterritorialization. If we just take this apparatus as is and then take control of it, it's just like the post-colonial states, right? The system that we're complaining about is still intact. We're just the ones running it. But that doesn't really improve the situation. I mean, maybe a little bit it will. But the fundamental problems we're dealing with and complaining about, it won't solve. And for me, the big riddle is, well, I think what happened was in 2017 and immediately afterwards, a lot of the third position is self-owned. They just did a lot of really stupid stuff to discredit themselves and get, BTFO'd. And so the people that were left over were the lulberts, and they just wear this mask. I'm an edgy lulbert with this mask that I'm wearing, and it's like, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. And ultimately, how does this get us back to any sort of, again, back to Michael Pohl, re-territory 2, which is somehow, indebted to the legacy and heritage of the past, territory 1. It doesn't. And, we should all kind of know this, right? Because I've said this before. If you were born in Kansas in 1900 on a farm, you had more in common with someone living in ancient Egypt in 3000 BC than somebody today. And what's the difference? It's technology. So all of these social interactions, all of these social considerations that we want to return to, many on the DR or this dissident space are accepting the very mechanism that is eroding it as the solution. Hence, tech people like Elon Musk. No, he represents what's destroying all this. Now, constructively, we see more and more people embracing a sort of tech skeptic or anti-tech perspective. So, for example, when Ted Kaczynski died, there was a lot of people in the DR who were, eulogizing his ideas. And other, more savory types. I mean, even Derek Jensen kind of became this unofficial hero, beginning with his clip about, what was it? The pedophile clip where he's doing the Jeopardy. And yeah, that was Keith Woods who made that popular. So that whole angle of looking at a tech skeptic is been good. And I hope to see more of that in the future. I also think that the idea of engaging the sort of ideological spokespeople of the left is just pointless. One, because these aren't people with ideas to be changed. They're paid to say this. It's their job. They're directly financially dependent on what they say. So that's the definition of a dishonest actor. So just sidestep it, right? Just sidestep it and don't worry about that. And furthermore, going back to my analysis of the culture war as a series of frozen conflicts led by counter gangs, I can also, at least with regards to the synthetic left, you can look at Caleb Maupin's work on the synthetic left. These people, yeah, I mean, obviously to your base and to unconverted normies, refute these lies and false positions. But engaging with them directly is just pointless. It just doesn't work. I mean, I've tried it. It doesn't work. I've seen other people do it more consistently than I have, confronting these people. It doesn't work. And furthermore, I guess you could say it's just bad strategy, right? Or in this case, bad tactics, right? Because in this community, whether it's the German stormtroopers of World War I or the Panzers of World War II, the doctrine was you don't attack the strong points, right? You find the weak points, you surround and encircle the strong points, and then you penetrate into the enemy's line of communications. And these sort of like spokesmen are in a sort of tactical battlefield sense, represent the strong points. Attacking them directly is not going to work. Or rather, it might work if you had overwhelming forces, which we don't. So, chipping away at the edges, which would be moving it to the level of the meta, right? The meta-political, the metaphysical, the meta-ethical, right? So by going to the meta, you can then change the game at the top and then force them to adapt rather than confronting them directly, which I think is a more successful way of doing this, not attacking them directly. So I'd like to see that change, because I think that's just not helpful, not constructive, not a good use of people's time and energy online creating content. And it would seem to me that there's a sort of crisis of content, in the sense of not that people aren't putting it out. They're putting out a lot of content. That's not the point. But what they're doing is they've sort of, and I've done this a little bit too, so it's not necessarily put down. We found our niches where we put out stuff that we're able to put out, that we're good at putting out, that people like us putting out. But it's sort of getting stale in a lot of ways because we're not generating new ideas. In fact, there was one of Dave's long form streams a few months ago. He talked. Well, actually, it was sometime in, I think, May or June, before the Shieldings event. He pointed that out, and I'm like, yeah, that's a problem. There's just not this idea creation like there used to be. In fact, I would argue there's a reversion, right? Because Moldbug is just some sort of like libertarianism with a new coat of paint. It's just deterritorializing continued. So it's not doing anything. And if it's not straight up Moldbugian crypto libertarianism, it's just straight up libertarianism, which again, 11 years ago it was third position, or even like with Keith Woods, a sort of more socialistic analysis, depending on who you were talking to. And this sort of like naive understanding that the cash nexus doesn't exist or have an effect on us, or that technology hasn't shredded human social relationships, like the Unabomber Manifesto points out, is just pathetic. It's just sad, right? We should be beyond this, but we're not. We've regressed, right? It's like, you can go to some countercurrent stuff from back in the day, and they were talking about some of this more, I wouldn't say they were full Ted pilled, but they were moving in that direction. I haven't been to countercurrents in years now, so I don't know where they stand on it now. But that's what I'd like to see more of. And I'm not seeing more of it, because ultimately is again, I'll be referring back to the Michael Poole video I did a lot, probably this stream. They keep defining themselves as in terms of past enemies to the hegemony, which is pointless, right? You're still fighting ideologically on their terms, because they're setting the terms of thought, all of thought, and you exist in that realm of thought by defining yourself as its past enemies. That needs to stop. What needs to happen is a reframing of the entire schema of thought, which is why I say we need to outflank them to the meta. We need to imagine a new future that can be described in positive, constructive terms without any direct reference to them. Now, in a holistic system of education, you would have to refer to the current, neoliberal techno-capital paradigm as a thing to escape and then move somewhere into. But the ultimate goal, the ultimate destination should be able to be described without making any reference to it. That's how you beat it. Now, once you can then define an entire way of life, an entire way of thinking, an entire mode of being without having to refer to what we're struggling against, that's the first step to winning. Because now we've advanced beyond the limits they've put on us. Because they've put limits on our thought. And as long as we let them limit our way of thinking, we will never be able to effectively do anything or challenge them. We have a few comments now that I think are relevant. One of them is by a major. What is your take on the criticism of Carol Quigley's work, particularly with the lack of sourcing in Tragedy and Hope book? Well, one, I haven't read Tragedy and Hope, but two, I'm not really aware of this criticism. But I can imagine, what it would be like. And I guess the problem I would have is his work is useful because what it does is it shows us that there's this plan, there's this structure of behavior of the technological dictatorship, and we have other supplementary adjoining works that will show this, that will demonstrate this. And so I don't know if it could stand on its own, but what it could do is be used as a way to sort of show us how they think, right? One of the things we've noticed with Sutton is because these people keep their own documentation under lock and key, you're not going to be able to have access to it. Sutton didn't have access to it. But he saw enough of what they were doing that he was able to piece together a certain MO. And I think what Carol Quigley is giving us is the MO. And yeah, well, a lot of that stuff you probably wouldn't have, you wouldn't be able to access the documentation because they have it under lock and key. Now, I posted earlier on my community the notification for this episode and for any submission of questions, and we have one. Let's go ahead and share screen here so everybody can see it. Let's see. Mass creation broadcasts. Wait, no one really. Well, the intent matters, but one day with these regular people will be asking questions for me. How do we appeal to different demographics and addressing problems of pre-collapse society to motivate them to prevent the damage? Boomers will react differently than millennials and Gen Zers, and each of them both have different reasons why collapse will be hard to deal with. Reasons why they would care and responsibilities during it. Younger people are both least equipped, both due to lack of equipment, experience, and deracination. P.S. If you'd like use being discontinuous from the past or being raised too deep on the simulation, and will be the ones which will have to deal with most to rebuild. But do they even know what to rebuild or how? This question also applies to how do we make the right more cooperative and less individualistic or profit oriented. Personally, I'll do things here and there to call to action, things which give people the orientation for a rich inner life, social network, and practical skills. But most of these I'll be rediscovering myself, so I expect it to take at least 5 years until I'm getting good at it. Given the progress with any escape already in the past 5 years, I like these odds. Oh yeah, these are all very good questions. It's hard to know where to start because a lot of these are interrelated problems. Okay, so how do we well, the first thing, what I would do, right, is I would look at each demographic not only by age, right, but by what their beliefs are, their ideologies and what they care about. And then since my general theory is that all of these ideologies have some true beliefs in them, sort of tailor the message to focus specifically on those elements that are most congruous with this broader narrative. And then give them information that they can digest, bit by bit in that way. And then after that, once they become more comfortable rethinking the rest of their ideology, give them some more of the red pill stuff, the stuff that's hard to take. This is a brief summary, back of the envelope sort of calculation. The harder part is going to be, what do you do with the resource issue? Yeah, millennials and Gen Z just don't have the resources. The short answer is you have to wait for boomers to die. And people are predicting over the next 10 to 15 years, there's going to be trillions of dollars of assets swapping hands. We'll have to see what happens with that. But in the short term, I guess, I don't know. That's a very difficult question to solve. I like how you ended this, where you talk about the inner life, developing all these skills. Yeah, develop the skills that you can. Not everybody can develop the same skills or is good at developing them, but work on that. Make the right more cooperative, less individual, and profit-oriented. I mean, the best way to do that would be to somehow, and this has been a problem that no one has been able to solve so far, a more religious revival where people take religion seriously. They take specifically Christianity seriously and act in a more altruistic, pro-social way. I mean, one way to do that would just be to call people out for the inconsistencies in their living. Just tell them, look, if you're not actually going to live up to what you say you're doing, then just stop calling yourself that. That might make people mad, but, it might cause them to change as well. So we have in the chat, Major, GF, Mass Creation Broadcast, LeSueur, Nathaniel Hood, CD13. Hello, Record Deepness, Eugene Andrews. Hello, everybody here. All right, let's see. Anything in the chat here? CD13, I don't think you have to restart the Moldbug series unless you write something real dumb. You and Legos thoroughly debunked them. Well, thank you. That's sort of our thoughts as well, personally. But for the sake of some viewers, we thought that might be a possibility in the future. Eugene Andrews, an oligarchic technocracy, or is it a technocratic oligarchy? I mean, I think ultimately the techno part comes first, as Ernst Jünger said, technology was the metaphysics of the 20th century, right? Both the communists and the capitalists in the Cold War believed that technology was the metaphysics of our century. So, or of the last century. So yeah, I would argue that in this case, that would come first. But the money element is still huge and trumps most other social goods. GF, do you think technology will go backward or just stagnate? And stuff like space colonization makes things worse instead of achieving whatever the right thinks the West Faustian urge is. Well, I believe that collapse will come, and of course, I'll just briefly define it. Collapse in the terms of what Joseph Taylor says: we go from a high energy state to a low energy state, and in going from a high to low energy state, depending on how rapid that is, and depending on how low that low energy state is, would be the level of severity of the collapse. I think we're reaching levels of diminishing returns in technological investments, as counselors argued for. And this is something. This is another thing too, right? Because that is frustrating about the DR, is they'll talk about the Faustian urge to explore and discover, and then they'll talk about, oh well, we're spiritual, we're not materialistic, right? A lot of the third positionists were like, well, capitalism and socialism are materialistic, but we're spiritual. But they can only think in terms of domination of territory. Well, okay, but why couldn't we express the Faustian spirit in exploring metaphysical realms of the soul and spirit? I mean, if you claim to be the spiritual ones, this should have been your first thing right out of the gate. But it wasn't, which makes me think they're crypto materialists all along, and possibly explains why the libertarian takeover has happened. They were that way all along. Let's see. CD13, fusionism and its consequences have been a disaster for the right. Yeah, that's a great usage of Uncle Ted there. Record Deepness, in light of the work of Sutton, should you be interested in looking into other aspects of Cold War history, specifically how the popular perception is wrong? I mean, that's a very good question. Sutton does force you to rethink the entire Cold War. And I'm not really sure the implications of all that yet. At some point, I probably will talk about it, maybe even with Keith Preston. But yeah, just as a sort of, again, back of the envelope kind of thing, I think basically the Cold War can just be seen as 1984. You had two enemies, that maintained vast military industrial complexes in order to point to the other as a threat to their existence, so that they could implement control over their populations, just like 1984. And that's also why it was this fairly controlled conflict that didn't spill over into a third world war like people feared, like in Central Europe or East Asia. Because of that, because it was this sort of scripted situation. Okay, let's see. Record Deepness, bingo. The reason the Lulberts stayed around was because they didn't do anything. Well, that's both the problem and their strength. They don't do anything, so they never get purged. But also, they don't do anything, so we're still stuck where we're at. It's just like, wow. Mass creation broadcasts. Oh, yes, that too. How do we deal with people just introducing their philosophy to new audiences instead of expanding it? I don't want to have thinkers do an endless chain of recaps. Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I suppose if I were to do that, what I would do is have like a core video series, like say maybe I don't know, 4 or 5 episodes, and say just watch this first, and then everything else I say will make sense. But that then forces you to like figure out what are your core principles and how do you want to explain all that. Still a work in progress for me, but yeah, it's something to think about and something I'll probably end up doing. And I think a lot of other people will too. I guess the other thing too is given the experience of this year, especially the IRL meetup at the Shieldings event, and future, current, and potentially future collaborations with content creators. I do think that there's reasons to be optimistic because, on the one hand, there does seem to have been this might change. So anything can happen in the online space, but there does seem to have been this chastening where people are less impulsive, less low inhib, less careless because of what happens, even with like doxing, right? So the problem that we haven't yet come over, actually, let me this is a central problem, and I'll look up a quote here from Screwtape Letters, which pretty much sums up in a nutshell what the problem is. Let's see, just looking it up here. So this is where Screwtape is talking to Wormwood about the nature of the possessive pronoun mine. We produce this sense of ownership not only by pride, but by confusion. We teach them not to notice the different senses of the possessive pronoun, the finely graded difference that runs from my boots, through my dog, my servant, my wife, my father, my master, my country, to my God. They can be taught to reduce all these senses to that of my boots and of my ownership. Even in the nursery, a child can be taught to mean by my teddy bear not the old imagined recipient of affection to which it stands in a special relation, for that is what the enemy will teach them to mean if we are not careful. But the bear I can pull to pieces if I like. Sounds like a libertarian notion of ownership here. And at the other end of the scale, we have taught men to say, my God is a sense not really very different from my boots, meaning the God on whom I have a claim for my distinguished services and whom I exploit from the pulpit, the God I have done a corner in. And all the time the joke is that the word mine in its fully possessive sense cannot be uttered by a human being about anything. In the long run, our Father below, our Father will not. In the long run, our Father or the enemy will say mine on each thing that exists, and specifically of each man. They will find out on the end, never fear, to whom their time, their souls, and their bodies really belong, certainly not to them, whatever happens. At present, the enemy says mine of everything on the pedantic, legalistic ground that he made it. Our Father hopes one day to say mine of all things on the more realistic, dynamic ground of conquest. Your affectionate uncle, Screwtape. What's interesting here is this concept of mine, right? The reason why any dissident political movement in the United States, this one as opposed to any other, can't work is because of this conception of mine. But notice what Lewis doesn't say. Lewis doesn't say my time. That's the real issue. In America, we have been taught to believe that we have a certain surplus and deposit of time that is for our own personal use, irrespective of anything. Filial obligations, work, anything. And in fact, we people put in half-assed efforts in those things in order to then carve out time for this. Well, no movement can survive if that's the case. Because ultimately, that idea has to be killed for a movement to work. Did you think people, in the Russian Revolution or in the Nazi Party thought of, my time as if they had personal time that they owned and the party didn't? No, of course not. And that's why they had machine-like discipline. Even in the American Revolution, which wasn't quite so mechanical, they didn't think that way either. And that's the problem. Record deepness. Screwtape letter plus that hideous strength, all 21st century political theory. Yeah, well, I don't know about that, but Lewis does have a way with things. Oh, well, also record deepness, you forgot the abolition of man. But that's all I got for tonight, guys. Tomorrow will be my last episode of the year where I finish up the best enemy money can buy. And then you can watch my appearance on Millennial on Thursday. So see you guys all later.